This video is brought to you by Blessed Be God Boutique, maker of Catholic fashionable apparel, handmade accessories, and more.
Malachi Martin knew what the Jesuits were planning to do to the church. He knew of their plan to invert the hierarchy of the church, to reform the church in such a way that would result in the democratization, essentially, of Catholicism, the inversion of the hierarchy, and everything else we see in the present Synod of Synodality. They had been working behind the scenes for decades. Much of the crisis in the church in the post-conciliar era can be laid at the feet of the Jesuits, because they have held positions of authority, very real authority, in the Roman Curia since before Vatican II. Much of the implementation argument, it can be argued, is based on the role the Jesuits played in answering questions from bishops and parish priests and the rest on how to properly implement Vatican II, their role of interpreting theological statements from Vatican II, and on it goes. Certainly they don't bear sole responsibility, but they have a very big part to play in this. As you're about to hear, this goes back more than a century of the beginning of their subversion of the church. But it was since the 1960s that they stopped being subtle about it. And it should not surprise anybody that the church is in a serious upheaval at a time when the church has its first Jesuit pope. That should make sense. He is implementing the schemes of the Jesuits that have been part and parcel of the Jesuit order since the time he was ordained a priest back in the late 1950s. And all of this should go and help you understand the present crisis in the church. This is Malachi Martin from his work, The Jesuits, on the subversion of the church by the Jesuits. And in the future episodes after this one, we will begin talking about this very specific things the Jesuits have done to the church up until the 1980s, setting the groundwork for understanding how we got to where we are today. In full view of that unparalleled achievement, it becomes fascinating to examine what sort of character the Society of Jesus developed during its centuries-long effort, or why or how in the 20th century it changed from its original purpose. Not that this is the first time that one or another group in the church has broken ranks and declared war on the papacy, but it is the first time that the Society of Jesus has turned on the papacy with a clear intent to undo the papacy's prerogatives, to dilute the hierarchic government of the Catholic Church, and to create a novel church structure. And it is the first time the Society of Jesus, both corporately and in its individual members, has undertaken a socio-political mission. Inigo founded his Company of Jesus, as he originally called it, for one purpose: to be defender of the Church and the papacy. The Pope, who brought the order into official existence in the 16th century, made that purpose the mission of the Society and the reason for its existence. As an institution, it has always been bound to the papacy. Its professed members have always been bound to the Pope by a sacred oath of absolute obedience. For 425 years they stood at the papacy's side, fought its battles, taught its doctrines, suffered its defeats, defended its positions, shared its power, were attacked by its enemies, and constantly promoted its interests all over the globe. They were regarded by many, as they regarded themselves, as Pope's men, and many extraordinary privileges granted by popes over the centuries were as badges of the trust the papacy placed in the society. Never, it can be said, did the Society of Jesus as a body veer from that mission, until 1965. In that year, the Second Vatican Council ended the last of its 4 sessions, and Pedro Arrupe Gondra was elected to be the 27th Father General of the Jesuits. Under Arrupe's leadership, and in the heady expectation of change sparked by the Council itself, the new outlook, anti-papal and socio-political in nature, that had been flourishing in a covert fashion for over a century was espoused by the Society as a corporate body. The rapid and complete turnabout of the Society in its mission and in its reason for being was no accident or happenstance. It was a deliberate act, for which Arrupe, as Father General, provided inspiring, enthusiastic, and wily leadership. Perceptions, however, especially in matters of great religious institutions, do not change easily or quickly. The reputation earned by the Society over hundreds of years was the best camouflage behind which to build the new and very different society that has come into existence over the past 20 years. In effect, the past and glorious history of the society has seemed to render present deeds invisible, and to make it possible for the new Jesuit leadership to present its new outlook to the world as the latest and finest expression of Ignatian spirituality and loyalty. For the general mass of Catholics, clerical and lay alike, it was unthinkable that the Jesuits, of all people, would propagate a new idea of the Church, or that they would wage war with even the Pope, let alone three, by denigrating him, deceiving him, disobeying him, waiting for each to pass away in turn in the hope that the next Pope would leave them with a free hand. Inevitably, the Jesuit war against the papacy has intensified during the pontificate of Caravaggio, as John Paul II. This charismatic, stubborn-minded man came to the papacy with his vivid experience of Marxists in Poland. Everything about him, but especially his aims, his policy, and his strategy as Pope, spoke of a sharp departure from everything that had been in vogue in Rome since the late 1950s. From the moment of his election, it was clear that John Paul was opposed by many in the Vatican bureaucracy he inherited. What was less clear, even to seasoned Vatican observers, was that he was also deeply opposed, and his authority was to be violently challenged as a matter of policy by the Society of Jesus. Nothing John Paul has tried since he came to the chair of Peter in 1978, and he has tried everything from persuasion to confrontation to direct intervention, has dissipated or even softened the resolute Jesuit stance against him. Thus far, the Jesuits have eluded the pontiff's efforts to corral them, and their example is still being followed on an ever wider scale. But as the society is learning, this Polish Pope is not another Paul VI. He refuses to throw up his hands in utter despair. On the contrary, he has just opened a new campaign in the war, this time on a battlefield of his own choosing. As John Paul II is learning, the Jesuits will be as clever and as witted in their answer to each new papal offensive as they have always been in everything they have done. In fact, it was the Jesuits, not the papacy, who fired the first salvo in the latest direct confrontation in the effort to take the initiative away from the papacy and the Roman hierarchy. Whatever the outcome of this latest campaign and of others that are sure to follow, there can be no doubt that during our lifetime, what the papacy stands for has become unacceptable to the Jesuits, and that what the Society of Jesus has lately come to stand for is inimical and therefore unacceptable to the papacy. Yet despite the fact that each now stands at the opposite pole from the other, there still remain powerful similarities between the papacy and the Society. Similarities that will mean the war between them will be lethal at a level to a degree that few wars are. The first and most powerful similarity is the ineradicable sense of divine mission that is the driving instinct of both papacy and Jesuits. Each of them claims to be acting solely for the worldwide common weal of God's people, and for the exaltation of the Church Christ founded on Peter. A second is that as organizations of manpower and equipment, each has a grip on the levers of immense worldly power. Each applies its energies and resources to specific situations with particular concrete and defined ends in view, year in and year out. Nevertheless, and this is yet a third similarity, amid the passion and seeming confusion that always accompany human activities, both papacy and Jesuits perform on a passionless and universal plane, with motives that do not permit the vulnerability of human feelings. Both grasp at the value of the present, passing moment, but both have hoary memories. Both constantly measure their plans and actions against a template of the future they wish to see realized, and both assume that time is on their side, plenty of time. It is on this capital point of time that the inevitable outcome of all the battles can best be glimpsed. For in the Roman Catholic perspective, and in the perspective of classic Ignatian Jesuitism as well, there is another dimension, another condition of human existence that overshadows this war between the papacy and the Society. Two cosmic powers, intelligent good and intelligent evil, personified in God and Lucifer, are locked in a life and death struggle for the allegiance of all human beings. That struggle becomes tangible, can be tracked and identified only in the multiple details of complex human situations. But by the same token, everything tangible, each and every human situation, is colored by what is transhuman and eternal. It is ultimately on that plane that the war between the papacy and the Society of Jesus is being fought, and on that plane, it is the papacy alone that has the divine promises of time. On the plane we occupy as viewers of contemporary events, we are unable to foresee what seeds of good may sprout in what we must sum up as a disaster area. We're too near those events. We lack perspective, as well as foreknowledge. We see through the glass of history darkly. We cannot therefore know what changes could come about for the Society of Jesus. If all the present extremisms in the Jesuit order were cut off, the obvious extremisms being the abandonment of basic Roman Catholic teaching, the replacement of it with sociological solutions, and the inevitable consequent abandonment of the prime Jesuit vocation to be Pope's men. Such a reform of the society and a new adhesion to its original charism seems, humanly speaking, unlikely when even a mild indictment of its latter-day condition is reviewed. You'll note there that he describes it as a war against the papacy. Now, that's an interesting way of describing it. But what do we see in 2024 from Rome? There were a couple of very major documents issued. One which was a study document, which is what they called it, a proposal, a modest, humble proposal to essentially strip the papacy of most of its power, elevate the bishops and especially the laity in the governing of the church, and make the bishop of Rome essentially just the first among equals, a very Eastern Orthodox view of the papacy. Meanwhile, of course, this idea, what little they've done for this idea, is being implemented through brute force by the Pope, and an ironic twist of fate. We've seen also, in addition to that, of course, the Synod on Synodality, which placed laity in key positions of authority at the Synod, and even though the Synod is over now, there are working groups, and they are meeting on various hot-button issues the Synod didn't quite get to, including the ordination of deaconesses. And all of this is part of what the Jesuits had been talking about for decades. You cannot really say that the church has always been synodal in nature, but the Jesuits have been arguing that for a very long time. They laid the groundwork for this decades ago. Francis is dedicated to it. They believed, from what it looks like Malachi Martin is saying here, that everything, all these weird ideas, were the proper implementation of Vatican II. And this goes beyond what the more progressive element in the church did after Vatican II. This is more extreme than their ideas. These are the Jesuit ideas for their Jesuit church, the synodal church. And Francis has said he believes the Synod on Synodality, and that his papacy especially, their entire purpose is to finalize the implementation of Vatican II, which he does not believe has been done yet. Even though you can read the documents of Vatican II and not really see a call for a synodal church where the Pope has no authority. You can't really find that in there. The Jesuits say you can, and that was what the purpose of Vatican II was. The Jesuits are undermining the papacy, and they're trying to undermine the Catholic Church. How successful they will be is entirely up to our Lord. Curious what you have to say about this. Let me know what you think of this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.